I want to introduce to you somebody that's been in comics for as long as I've been able to read. 4 decades, 5 decades. He created Grendel. He created Mage. These two characters have had a life of their own. He's done some great Batman books, DC Trinity. What else? He is a co-creator of the Dead Boy Detectives, as well as he is working on bringing more than 4, possibly, but definitely 4 graphic novels about Dracula with Kelley Jones. Everybody say hello to Mr. Matt Wagner.
Hey, everybody. I'm good, man. How are you?
Well, this is hour number 1, hour 12 of the last day of streaming. So,
Hold on.
Yeah, hold on, everybody, because this could get weird. But everything's been going great, and I'm really glad that we have this opportunity to talk. I watched a lot of interviews with you when you guys were pumping out the Kickstarter. And yeah. And I'm really excited for it. I got on that hardcover real quick and really excited to see it, because I know this seems to be like a labor of love for you.
Well, for your viewers that didn't see any of those, let me just give a little backstory here. So, I've been friends with Kelley Jones for many, many, many years. We you mentioned the Dead Boy Detectives. That was one chapter out of the Season of Mists story arc on the Sandman. Exactly that. Yep. Season of Mists. I always get my S's wrong on that thing. So we've been friends ever since we met on the various promotional signing gigs for that run. And we immediately hit it off. We had obviously a mutual interest in horror literature of all sorts, and similar sense of humor and such, and about the same age, so same point of references and all that kind of thing. And we always said, we got to do something together someday. And he did Kelley drew one of the Grendel Black, White, and Red stories. But when we say this, we got to do something. We meant something significant, not just a little one-off. So, we kept saying that back and forth to each other as the decades rolled on, and we were each kind of going our separate ways in our own careers. And finally, I had posted something on Facebook a while back, and he commented on it and tagged on that we really got to do something together. And I had been brewing on this Dracula idea for a decade or more, and a whole different way to approach the character and the narrative. And I contacted him. I said, "So, man, are you really serious about that? Because I got an idea now that I think is just fucking perfect for both of us, And but it's going to take 5 years, maybe more, out of our lives, and luckily he was at a spot and I was at the right spot, and he said yes and I said yes, and we took it from there. And my big idea, our big approach was, every time there's a new version of Dracula, they always say, it's the most faithful to the book. And seriously, so far of the films, there hasn't been one.
Right.
There are others, but there really hasn't been one.
Pieces, but not a whole.
Well, always kind of the wrong approach. The famous Coppola version. I have a real love-hate relationship with that one, because I love the filmmaking. The fact that it was all old school filmmaking. There's no CGI in it. It's all old school film tricks. But this whole idea that Dracula sees Mina as his reincarnated lost love, that's nowhere in the book. There's no evidence of that at all. Dracula is not a romantic character. He is just a monster.
Yeah.
And so my idea was let's really stick to that, but as opposed to just doing another adaptation of the novel, of which comic book wise there have been many over the years.
Right.
I said, there's the thing about the novel is Dracula is this indelible character, and yet he's hardly on screen at all. He's there on screen when Harker goes to the castle at the beginning of the book. Then once he goes to London, he's gone. He's invisible the entire time. So there's all these really cool. Let me backtrack a bit. I equate it to Hannibal Lecter in Silence of the Lambs.
Right.
The most indelible character in that film. He's on screen 16 minutes.
Also, Jaws.
Well, yeah, of course. Yeah. The shark you hardly see at all. Yeah.
Yeah.
The shark doesn't have a lot of personality to him. But there's all these really terrific hints and allusions to Dracula and his background and his history and such. So my idea was, let's show all the stuff that isn't the novel. let's start with the first one is his story of how he becomes a vampire, and then move forward through time. But we will not see any of the events of the novel. We won't see Harker. We won't see Van Helsing. We won't see Mina. But we have plenty of story to tell other than that. So
it's like jazz. It's everything that happens in between the notes.
Yeah, true that.
Yeah. How much? I mean,
man, I don't know if you've seen any of the art, but it looks like Kelley was just born to draw this. You know, it's as you said, a labor of love for both of us. You know.
Yeah, and it's funny because growing up, I remember my friend handed me Red Rain, Bloodstorm, and Crimson Mist, and I never read Kelley's. I never read a book that Kelley did. I only was familiar with the covers during like the Nightfall run and stuff.
Yep.
It's still my favorite Batman story of all time. Like, no offense to Batman Grendel, but it's still my favorite Batman because it's Doug Munch, you know, like he does great horror stuff, but Kelley is born for it. He was born to do that. And so when I saw the first couple of pages that you showed off, and when they showed it off on Kayfabe, I was like, wow, like I am beyond stoked for it because you know, it's you and Kelley. How much?
Let me give a little shout out too to our colorist. We have Jose Villarrubia coloring it, and I will say this is a little telling tales outside of school, but we had somebody else lined up initially, and I had a certain approach that I wanted with the color, and I gave this person, very famous colorist, I gave this person these notes, and it was quite a while before they turned anything in, and then it was the exact opposite of all the notes I'd given.
Wow.
And I was just like, no, we can't move forward with this. We're dropping you. And luckily Jose was available. And my approach was that, so many times I look at Kelley's art colored and I'm really dissatisfied with it because people try to color him too dark. They're like, oh, he's dark and moody. I'm going to color him dark and moody. Well, no, he's already drawn all the dark and moody in there. You know, you need something vibrant so you can see all that line work he's done, you know? So I ported Jose to like Italian giallo films, you know, which are very brightly lit. So I said, go look at Suspiria by Dario Argento and go look specifically at Black Sabbath by Mario Bava, both of which are like lit up with neon colors, and they're really cool and scary. And he really took that to heart, and it really, coloring wise, it really has an old school vibe from the period of books that, you know, Kelley and I grew up reading. So that was a real thrill for us to have that all come together.
And Villarubia has been on he's been on a roll lately with the
he really has,
and the Swamp Thing. Like he is primed to color stuff that looks like it would, you know, even though it's a new book, it would have the feel of something from the 60s, 70s. Yeah. So really super excited for it. I've never read Bram Stoker's Dracula. I'm familiar with it from a standpoint of like you've, talked about, like he is maybe the most famous literary character of all time. Although I'd like to point out that Batman is probably that holding the top second spot at this point.
Well, if you're going to include visual storytelling too, I'm talking about just sheer prose.
Sure.
And from what would be considered classical literature, you know, I mean, the other kind of natural contender is Sherlock Holmes.
Sure. Yeah.
And sure, Sherlock Holmes really integrates into almost every aspect of culture worldwide, but kind of Dracula more, you know, like there's literally not a corner of the earth you could go to and say Dracula and they wouldn't know who you meant and what you meant.
Especially because, like if you take the fact that vampire as a word is also worldwide, we know, everybody can associate the two. Speaking of Dracula, I'd like to say hello to our friend, actual Dracula, who's in the house. But yeah, that is pretty interesting. I don't know if you've ever done a Sherlock story, but at this point now you're gonna have under your belt Dracula stories, Batman stories, and maybe you should do a Sherlock story at some point.
It's funny you should say that because I've been last couple of weeks I've been listening to audible versions of Sherlock stories on Spotify as I'm working. I have those running, so that's kind of neat.
So let's go back to the beginning, or go back. Your first comics and first artists that inspired you, but more so, I'm actually interested in when did you become a history buff? Because your comics are loaded with factual, architecture, history, times, and places that were real.
That we try and keep accurate. Yeah. I mean, in fact, in Dracula, one of the people that, we had helping us run the campaign said to me at one point, there was one particular line I had, and he said,
Mhm.
that line takes me out of the time period.
Yeah.
And I went and reassessed it, and I was like, yeah, he might be right there. So I switched it and niggled it to make it fit a little better.
Yeah.
My love of history basically comes from a voracious reader. My mom
Mhm.
was an English teacher. I was an only child. And so she, I grew up kind of out in the country, not near a lot of
Mhm.
playmates. And she encouraged me to read. And, the more you read, the more you become interested in all sorts of things,
Sure.
And, I always had a fondness for, Greek myths and the stories of Robin Hood and King Arthur. So all of which had a historical element to them.
Yeah.
And that always intrigued me to kind of learn about the time and place that these stories took place in, and
Yeah.
how they were contemporary, And in fact, this is a great segue. In fact, that's when it came time for me to do Mage. I had
Mhm.
originally started as I said, I was interested in King Arthur. I had originally started a story about the return of King Arthur, and it was much more ordinary. Number one, I was nowhere near skilled enough to handle the project I was attempting to accomplish. But it was much more ordinary. It was, kind of set in an apocalyptic future, and the guy wore a cape, and blah 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 blah. And so then DC announced that they were going to do Camelot 3000, and I was just like,
With
well,
Holland, yeah.
that idea has been taken, and that Bolin guy draws a whole lot better than I do. So.
He's quite good.
Yeah. So then it came out, and it just did nothing for me because it didn't integrate those characters into that contemporary world in my mind.
Mhm.
It was like they were all wearing armor. I didn't know anybody that wore armor in modern. King Arthur was even in a Superman costume. He was wearing red, yellow, and blue. And I just knew that maybe there was a way for me to tell that story, but I had to make it much more personal and much more contemporary. And the
Mhm.
guys I knew were, running around the alleyways in the city in jeans and t-shirts, and nobody had a sword, but a
Yeah.
couple of baseball bats stuffed under the seat of the car just in case, And I think that's crucial towards making these stories work, is that they integrate into the time and place they take place. And in fact,
Yeah.
I kind of go on ad nauseum about this, in that, to my mind, most every pop culture character works best in the time and place they were originally created.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Superman and Batman, they're running out of steam because they don't fit into the contemporary world. The idea of Batman being this character that sneaks around in the dark and scaring people, that's just gone from the contemporary version of Batman. He's a
Yeah.
paramilitary character now. And people always used to make fun of, well, how do the Superman's glasses?
Yeah.
Well, because that took place in a time and a day when everybody wasn't photographed all the time,
Right. There weren't
And
cameras everywhere. There weren't
yeah,
lights
my
everywhere.
parents were from that era, and I have maybe 2 photos of them from that time,
Mhm.
and they were standing still, they were posing. There was not much any of candid photography, and a guy
Yeah.
moving as fast as Superman, it would be hard to catch a clear photo of him.
It's a good way to
Um,
think about it.
and, Batman, there's no way a billionaire could be leading that kind of secret lifestyle. TMZ would be all over him all the time, and the Shadow, one of my favorite characters. The Shadow only works in a time and a place where cities still had shadows. And I don't know the last time you were in New York City, but it's lit up like a pinball arcade everywhere you look,
I grew up in New York, and I left in 2014, and you're right. Like, by
Yep,
even post 9/11, it
yep,
was a
yep,
different city
yep.
for
And
that
he
matter.
only works at a time and place when every man on the street still wore hats.
Yeah, yeah, and
'Cause
scarves,
otherwise, like,
hats.
who's that guy in the hat? Why has he got that hat on?
Yeah, why is he wearing a trench coat, a
Yeah,
hat, and a
yeah,
scarf?
yeah.
Yeah,
Whereas, long coats and hats, that's what people wore in those days.
yeah.
So, I really kind of try to keep things within their framework. Similarly, James Bond, I find, works best in the 60s with that Cold War paranoia, with all the sexism and racism that comes along with it.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. Yeah,
uh,
I mean, there aren't there are still people creating movies, music, books, and stuff in time periods that really connect with people. But you're right; it definitely, you can't, they don't have the same feel. It's probably why I've never been a Superman fan, honestly, is because those stories, they didn't work for me as a kid. Although there are some, like For All Seasons is one of those books that like I could read endlessly, you know. But
well,
so
that's because it captures the spark of what was there in the original version,
yeah,
the farm boy. The
yeah,
farm boy come to the city. That runs throughout that entire story.
hmm,
And that's why it works,
yeah,
a dollop of decency
hmm,
from an uncomplicated world that goes to a complicated world and tries to help make it better.
yeah, yeah, and that is the through line that really works. So one of the things I've always wondered, look at Mage and you look at Grendel, and the art style there's definitely differences in it. And I know where Grendel comes from, obviously inspired by Beowulf in the name. Where does the design come from? Like, what were you inspired by on the design of Grendel? Because very unique design.
Well, okay, so let me talk a little bit about where the narrative inspiration comes from. So it's not just Grendel. It's in fact a book called Grendel that I read when I was about 12 or 13 by a fellow named
Hmm.
John Gardner. And it was the story of Beowulf, but it was told from the point of view of the monster. So
Yes.
it was sympathetic to the monster, and that really kind of threw me at the time.
Hmm.
And then when I was about 17, discovering the works of Michael Moorcock, specifically the Elric saga.
Right.
And Elric was an anti-hero like none I had ever seen before. He was a character who you really were with and rooted for, and he does a lot of terrible things. He ends up killing almost everybody that's dear to him,
Oof.
um, and uh, and that really kind of shook me. I mean, you grow up with these heroes, and the idea, like in Superman, where the bad guy gets caught and he gets his comeuppance, and then the older you get, you look around the world and you realize that's not the way it works. There's a lot of times the bad guy does not get caught and does get away with everything.
Very true.
And so all those things kind of added up to me wanting to come up with a character that was not a good guy, and
Yeah.
you got to remember at the time, anti-heroes were not a big thing in comics.
Right.
DC and Marvel had both tried to feature villains as lead characters in some of their comics, never worked.
Never worked.
DC did a Joker book way back when, only lasted 2 issues. Can you imagine that nowadays?
Yeah.
You
And
know,
then
I mean,
yeah, it
uh,
is kind of nuts.
Marvel did a thing called Super Villain Team Up that would come and go. It'd last for a couple issues and they'd kind of relaunch it again, but it never really took. And the reason was those weren't the main characters, and you knew they weren't the main characters.
Yeah.
Whereas I wanted to do a book where the bad guy was clearly the main character. And
Yeah.
so I sat down to try and design this sleek ninja-like Zorro-like kind of costume. And I chose to, use a 2-blade. I always loved the idea of a sword cane. There's a great romantic element to that.
Yeah.
And I chose the 2 blades so that it would be fork-like and accent the devilish motif. But I always thought clowns were scary. Now it's kind of acknowledged after Stephen King's It. That clowns are scary. And sat down and the original designs I did were all kind of clownish, and I just kept honing that down, taking away elements until we ended up with the design as you see it.
Yeah.
I mean, the slashes through the eyes, evoke a kind of Harlequin sort of thing. Alice Cooper-ish.
Sure. Yeah.
The white nose to me gives it a kind of skull, negative skull sort of look.
Mhm.
And those slashes end up looking kind of like tusks and horns,
Yeah.
and also
Dark
very
Pictures.
vague. It's not distinctly tusks and horns, it's not
Right.
like that's what they are. It just evokes a certain flavor like that. So that's how I ended up on the design of the character.
Yeah, and it's a great design. Like I've never heard anybody talk about it, but I got to imagine that maybe McFarlane might have been looking at that when he designed Venom, because
No comment. No comment.
no comment. Fair enough. Fair enough. Um, and then, but Mage, like the art style on Mage, I see some of the earlier stuff, maybe even kind of, were you looking at CC Beck or
Yeah.
maybe Carl
Okay.
Hart?
So you're talking about influences. I would
Yeah,
say one of a mid-teen. I mean, everything influenced me.
Sure.
if you look at the stuff I'm doing now on Grendel, you can see that I really liked heavy metal when I first discovered it.
Yeah.
I loved Richard Corbin's work, that vibrancy of color, the theatrical lighting. But when I was probably 14 to 15, my two favorite books were Shazam, the DC relaunch of Captain Marvel, and Joe Kubert's run on Tarzan.
Okay.
And the run on Tarzan is affected me more in my style of storytelling. Kubert showed me when to get big, when to pull back, when to keep it simple, how you could get away with showing stuff and not showing stuff. You know, when I go through those Kubert Tarzan books, you look at it, there's points where he chooses to draw a lot of jungle. And then there's points where there's hardly anything there, you know, and it's just a field of green.
Yeah.
And that struck me even then. It's like, wow, why does that work? My mind is filling in that jungle and he didn't draw it, you know? So how do you get away with that? How do you utilize that to accentuate your drama to the best degree? And of course, the simplicity of Beck's drawing just always appealed to me. It was just so direct and straightforward. It had a real muscularity to it. At the same time, there was expressive cartoonishness to it. So yeah, those were I would say two enormous influences on me at the time. In my very formulative years. Yeah.
Yeah. Beck seems to be one of those heavy influences. I'll have Eric Larson on later today, and I know he's a huge CC Beck fan.
I know he is.
Yeah. And
I was with him. Here's a little fun story. I was with him at a con in New York, and I didn't know that he lost his house in the big Berkeley fires one year.
Yeah.
And he had inherited an almost complete collection of Captain Marvel from his father, and he lost it all. So he'd been slowly replacing it, and he reached under his chair and pulled out, you know, a copy of Whiz Comics #2. I was like, wow, good start.
Yeah.
I know he's a huge fan.
Yeah, and he talks about it a lot, and you know, influences always fascinate me. And in that, I know I've heard you talk and I've seen you wearing, you know, shirts saying so, but you're a big, you know, like 70s punk fan. You know, the New York scene seems to be specifically, and you were in Philly at the, you know, in Pennsylvania, right, at the time.
Yep, Philly, yep. Yep.
Did that play a big role, like the music play a big role in your comics creation? And
it always does.
Yeah.
And in fact, here's a funny story, something I have coming out very soon. So my son's a big fan of Last Podcast on the Left. And he turned me on to it, and through it, I discovered a sister podcast, the main guy, Marcus Parks, does with his wife, called No Dogs in Space. And it's a deep dive into all my favorite bands, you know, the Ramones, Velvet Underground, New York Dolls, the Replacements, Patti Smith, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
So I love that podcast so much that I sent them a little kudos email to their Gmail account. And Marcus got back in touch with me, and he's like, "Oh my God, I'm a huge Sandman Mystery Theater fan, you know." And so he said, "Would you be possibly interested in collaborating and drawing something I'm going to write?" And I've almost never done that in my career. I've only worked with other writers about 5 times. But he said it's going to be a story about Sid and Nancy.
Oh, nice.
So I did it, and it's coming out in the next volume of Last Comic Book on the Left.
Is that published by Z2?
That's published by Z2, and that comes out. It's a big, thick, you know, like each issue is like a big graphic novel size thing.
Yeah.
But our story, they're also going to issue as an separate ash can, all of its own on newsprint. So it'll have a real vibe to it. Yeah.
I love that.
Those things I do these days. That one's colored by my son, Brennan.
Right. And he's gotten into it, and that's really great. Going back to the music thing. Did you ever catch a show at CB's?
No, CB's kind of. By the time I got up to that area, it was kind of well past its prime, and it just wasn't in those kind of bands anymore. I did manage to catch the Replacements a couple times, but never saw the Ramones. Yeah, well, you know,
I was lucky enough to see the Ramones when I was like 15 or something at Lollapalooza, and it was like I knew who they were, and I knew I want to be sedated, so I was like totally into it.
Yeah.
So Comico, where you released Primer, your first Grendel story, your first published work is Primer 2. The one thing I wanted to ask about that, Primer 5, and I wasn't old enough to be buying books, but Primer 5 is the first Sam Keith. Did you meet him when he did you guys
I was the editor on the book when when his story ran. So
wow.
that was years later when I was working on Mage. It became clear that I was not going to be able to handle everything because I was writing it, drawing it, and coloring it. The only thing I wasn't doing was lettering it, but I didn't have enough time to do them all. And at the time, coloring had become so important to me that if I was going to let anything go, it was the inks. And so Sam so very obviously used a brush for all of his inking as opposed to a pen, that I thought of him immediately, and that's how he came on board to ink the last 9 issues of Mage, of the first Mage series.
That's he's a hell of an artist, and you guys, like, that whole scene was so amazing. And I know you're a part of a lot of different kind of through lines through a lot of people's careers. And somebody I recently had on the show a couple weeks ago, one of your really good friends, Mike Allred, you're responsible for kicking his career off.
Yeah, so he says.
Yeah.
Knowing Mike, I tend to think he would have found his way into it anyway. But
sure.
But I happened to be there at a certain time. For people that don't know this story, Mike was in the Air Force at the time. He was stationed in Germany, and I was living in San Jose. And I was near the offices of Slave Labor Graphics, and I was friends with the publisher. And I'd go over and have lunch with him occasionally. And one day I'm over there, and he goes, "Look at this, man!" And he pulls out this art drawer. He's like, "This guy in Germany keeps sending me like these full size paintings, and they were really cool." And so I said, "Well, give me his address." And I dropped him a postcard and said, "If you're ever back in the States, give me a call." And he called me from Germany, and then we got in touch when he got back in the States too. But and as far as kickstarting his career, it was more just me. It was just encouragement. It was me just saying, "Dude, you're good. Like, continue this. This is something you should really." I wouldn't bullshit you. You have a real skill here, and you have a chance, and you have a work ethic, and you should really, if this is what you want to do, I'd say give it a shot.
And he talked about how he was real dejected with Jaguar stories, and like he was almost ready to just be done with it. I mean, all sometimes you need is some positive reinforcement to really, do what you feel like you should be doing, and so. That's
there's an old saying, comics will break your heart, I mean, because there's, be frank, it's not the sort of money-making venture like music can be and film is, but we do it out of just a sheer love for it, and and you'll run into a lot of unscrupulous people on the business end, and a lot of just the sheer amount of effort it takes to produce a comic. I mean, I always point out to young people that are wannabes that are showing me their stuff at cons, and I said, here is my most crucial bit of advice. You have to draw every day, not just when you feel like it. You have to force yourself to draw every day. I said, look, if you were on the football team, you'd know you had to practice every day.
Right.
Train every day. If you were in a symphony, if you played an instrument, you knew you had to practice every day. You got to think the same way about art. You have to draw every day, because think about the last drawing you did. How long did that take you? Imagine 1,000 of those drawings that it takes to make up a comic book, and you have to do all those in a month. And that's what it takes. So if you want to do it, you have to train yourself. You have to toughen yourself up, and you have to develop a certain skills and speed and a way of working that'll enable you to produce,
Yeah. And speaking of that, like I've had Larson on the program before. I've had a lot of, veterans on the channel before, and he was telling one time that he had to do, like some issue of Spider-Man in 8 days. And like, those deadline crunches, what can you remember a point in your career where maybe it was like the biggest crunches that you ever had to deal with, that you were doing multiple books at once? That
I generally don't stack up like that. But I do remember I was working on the second Batman Grendel crossover when I got a call from Mark Chiarello that he was starting up this new series called Batman Black and White.
Mm.
Wanted me to be in the first series, and it was only an
Right.
8-page story, but
Yeah.
I was really like under the crunch with Batman Grendel 2. So I remember I ended up at that point I had a studio outside of my house, and I remember I ended up putting in just a few extra hours every day, and I would go in like an hour earlier, and I would work till 2 o'clock on Batman Grendel 2, then lay that aside, and then pull out
Wow.
Batman Black and White and work on that till it was time to go home. And it got done. I mean, that's, you know, again, you just have to be rigorous about it and not give in to I'm not inspired, you know. Fuck that, you know. You gotta. I always claim I know how to slap my muse around. And part of that is just, you know, you have to know when you've hit a little wall, and don't despair. Just figure out how to break it. You know, get up, do something for half an hour. You know, go wash the dishes. Go, you know, take your dog for a walk. Go, you know, go do something else. When you come back, your mind will have cleared a bit, and a whole new way of looking at what was confounding you up until that time. You know.
And you know, from a standpoint of creating, you know, I do the show, I have a podcast, like I'm a comic seller, like I'm put together a 48-hour Comic-Con this weekend, and sometimes you just have to, you're right, just go do something else.
Yeah.
Let it subside, because there are days where I'm just like, I don't want to get in front of a camera. I don't want to turn the microphone on. So I love that.
Yeah, within reason, you should excuse yourself in that regard. You know, there are some days where it's just like, all right, I'm just not feeling it today. Today I'm not working, you know?
Yeah.
But then you don't get that for more than one day at a time.
No, you don't. You know, or you take yourself a vacation. Like OAX was a vacation for me. That was like the perfect thing. Like I had so much fun there, and then I got to see my parents because they live in Florida. But it was like, yeah, I'm gonna work. I'm gonna film all this stuff. But then I'm gonna go buy a bunch of comic art and meet some comic artists and talk comics. Jumping ahead to, so kind of in line with what I talked about with All Red, but how did you hook up with Neil Gaiman? And also, you know, I know you're not happy with Netflix these days, but congratulations on at least having that co-creator credit on Dead Boy Detectives.
Yep. Yeah, and I know I haven't seen any of it, but Neil's super happy with it. So
yeah, that's what I've heard.
I trust his opinion on those things. I happened to be in the DC offices one day, and Dick Giordano pulled me aside and said, "Hey, we have a visitor here from Britain. I want you to meet Neil Gaiman." And that was it. And you know, I said, "Oh, I love your work." And you know, I forget if I had read anything by him at that point, but he was obviously there to talk about Sandman.
Sure.
The getting the series.
Maybe you read Black Orchid.
I don't think he'd even done Black Orchid yet. Maybe I can't remember, but I seem to remember that I had read something by him, and I did know something, but I can't remember what. But yeah, that's how. And then so I can tell this tale since it's dead and gone now. I forget how he and I started talking about it, but we contacted Giordano and said, we want to do a Superman project. We want to like him writing, me drawing. And twice DC flew me to places he was at in the States. And, you know, in between, like I remember he was in Santa Barbara and he was doing a presentation at one of the UC campuses there, UC Santa Barbara. And then, you know, the whole weekend, other than that, we were holed up in either his hotel room or mine talking about it. And for a variety of reasons, political inner office DC bullshit, it never came to me.
Ah, shit. That would have been killer.
I think so too. But
yeah. That book is kind of, Sandman's the book that really got me into reading, be writer focused and like follow readers around, because it was just, I never read anything like it before. And so I'm excited to see the series, and I hope, you know, at least you're happy with it, because, you know, fucking Netflix, right? I mean,
well, I noticed somebody here in the comments is asking about Netflix. So yeah, that was pretty crushing. It was you know, yes, they filmed the entire series.
Yeah.
They filmed the entire series and killed it. And the way that came about was about 2 years ago. I don't know if you remember this. Netflix was a dumpster fire. You know, their stock their stock was crashing like a meteor. Their stock devalued 75-80% in the space of 6 months.
Mm-hmm.
And that makes management go insane, and they started doing all these like witch hunt, almost managerial purges, and we lost the executive that was in charge of our show. And the guy that inherited it was just never into it, claimed he didn't get it. He was just like, where are the superpowers? Where's the good guy? Where's the bad guy? I was like, well, there aren't any superpowers, and the main character is a charismatic psychopath. It's all gray. It's not black and white. And I equate it to, how when a new alpha lion takes over a pride, he kills all the cubs from the previous alpha, and that's what happened. So,
and it stays in hell forever, because like you never see these types of shows. Like one I remember kind of seeing a trailer for was the first Lock and Key series that Joe Hill did, and they killed it, and they never released that show.
Yeah, well, they'll never release this. I have the whole thing on Blu-ray.
Yeah.
But it's still only the first episode's completely done. It still needs X amount of money to finish it in post-production, and they're just not willing to do it. So
it's such a shame. Like that's something like even in my generation, like your generation, that was never a thing. Like they never filmed stuff and then killed it for a tax break. Yeah. You would never hear about anything like that.
They go with the I think a lot of that has to do with streaming. Streaming's a different beast than you don't sell advertising. So if the television networks produced something, well, they were going to put it on because they could sell ads for it. They'd recoup some of their money.
Yeah, and we'd all have a discussion about shitty or good TV, whether.
But but everyone I've shown it to has really enjoyed it, really liked it. I mean, Kelley, I showed it to Kelley Jones, and he was just like, "God damn, man! Everybody complains these days about how comic book movies are getting to be all the same. It's all the same." Every character has the same arc. It's all the same kind of angst. It's all the same kind of problems. He's like, this isn't that. This is this is this main character who you're kind of rooting for, and yet he's nuts. I mean, violently nuts.
He's violent. Yeah. And they don't have anything like that. I mean, like I said, it's a shame, but maybe one day someone will opt it again and redo it, and we'll get it eventually. I mean, once again, maybe the power of Neil Gaiman bringing series after series that are good, Sandman and hopefully Dead Boy Detectives and Good Omens, like that should give life to indie characters getting a life on screen.
You would hope. Yeah. I mean, all of us, none of us imagine this was a possibility,
right.
Going into it, I mean, the production crew was great and really into it. Our first block director, a guy named Rachel Goldberg, was who's very accomplished TV director, and she contacted me and said, this was my favorite show I've ever worked on. I hope it goes for 10 seasons.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you're still going to be you and create comics, so that won't.
Yeah, it didn't slow me down in that regard. We did this. I recently redid the original Grendel storyline, Devil by the Deed. And we called it Masters Edition. And the thinking behind that was Dark Horse had reissued all the Grendel stuff in big fatty omnibus editions. And that's great for Grendel fans and everything. But my thought was, if somebody's coming to Grendel from the show, a 600-page omnibus might be intimidating.
Yeah,
when I went and looked at the original storyline, because you got to remember the original storyline was serialized in the back pages of Mage. So Devil by the Deed, the original Hunter Rose storyline, which I have since expanded on with a variety of short stories, but the original storyline, the core storyline, is only 37 pages long.
Well, I had
considering the legacy it spawned, that's kind of shocking, right? So I approached Dark Horse and said, "Look, let me just redo Grendel and the original storyline, which is the template for the show, and that'll give us, a more moderate-sized book. And so at least we got this beautiful book out of it, because I was really happy with the way it turned out."
Yeah, the original. I used to have the original magazine-sized trade paperback with the Alan Moore introduction, which was pretty cool.
Yep.
It's interesting, early 80s. maybe it's the last time that we'll ever have something like that, where short kind of anthology type things spawn these long-lived characters. Albedo 2 is a great example of that too. Steve Galacci puts Stan Sakai's first Usagi Yojimbo story in, and here we are 40 years later,
Yeah.
and he has put out hundreds of stories of Usagi.
Yeah.
But I don't know if we're gonna ever get that anymore.
Well, there again, like characters belonging to their time and place. I think artistic movements belong to a certain time and place too. So the publishing zeitgeist and motifs have changed, and I don't know. I think you have the same thing with certain web comics, where something starts out kind of slow and picks up steam and develops into a much larger narrative based on a few brief appearances, on some other site,
And I like what Distillery's doing right now with their stuff, and who knows what that's going to spawn. Like if those characters and stories will continue on in years. But one person I wanted to ask you about, because I had Mahfoud on, I had Allred on, and you are right at the top of the working with Kevin Smith when Kevin Smith decided to start making comics. Was Oni Double Feature was the beginning of the View Askew verse, and
I drew his first story.
Yeah. And so how did that come about?
I met Kevin, and I forget what year it was, but it was just before Mallrats came out. He had just finished filming Mallrats. And we were at San Diego, and he came by my table, and he bought a whole lot of pages off me, and really expressed this enormous love for Mage. And then, just kind of kept in touch over the years. He made an attempt at getting Mage made as a film, didn't pan out. But then, when Oni started up, I was dear friends with Bob Schreck, the founder, and Joe Nosemack, his partner at the time. And they had succeeded in getting Kevin to agree to write stuff in the View Askew universe, as you said.
Yeah.
And they approached me, and they said this would just be the perfect pairing because he loves your stuff so much. And so I did it. It was a delightfly rude little tale called Walt Flanagan's Dog. Jay and Silent Bob story. Yep.
Yeah, he he really did bring a lot to comics. Like I and then obviously he goes on, you guys do that Green Arrow series, and he writes a bunch of stuff for DC and
well, that too. Bob Schreck was the editor on that, and he approached me and said, Kevin's gonna be writing this. Would you? He asked if you'd be willing to do the covers. So then I was only going to stick on for Kevin's covers, and then Brad Meltzer took over. And I don't know if anybody knows this or not, but Brad used to be college roommates with Judd Winnick.
Oh, I did not know that.
And I was good friends with Judd at the time, and I still am. And Brad was coming through town on a promo tour for his latest novel, and we got together for dinner, and he just gave me the big bag to stay on as a cover artist. And he had a couple ideas in mind for cover images, and they were cool enough that I was like, yeah, okay, I'll stick around. And so I stuck around through his run. And then Judd took over, and Judd gave me the whole sob. Well, you're going to do my covers too, right? And I did a bunch of his before finally, and then I was just like, all right, guys, I'm about Green Arrowed out. I gotta.
Yeah, that's a long time to be doing Green Arrow covers.
Yeah. And in fact, one of my favorite covers was the one towards the end of Kevin's run, where he introduced the new supervillain Onomatopoeia.
Yep.
Who his shtick is that he says a sound effect, basically. Because I got to paint, I did all these big sound effects behind him, and these
amazing,
vibrant covers, and there was almost no green on the cover. There was one, this little arrow that he's breaking is green, because when you're doing a character that is color based, you end up using a lot of that color. And like you said, Mage is just black, whites, and reds. I'm sorry. Yep.
Do you? And painting's always been like a big part of your career. Do you ever still just kind of paint for fun?
No.
Just
no. I've talked about this with various other friends. Well, Tim Sale, sadly, before he passed, we used to he and I were tight buddies, and we often talked about how we have found ourselves becoming narrative artists.
Yeah.
That we don't do stuff just for the fun of it. That it always has to have a narrative purpose, you know. And so as a result, yeah, it's everything's headed towards a story, you know.
Yeah. All right. Well, I mean,
no imagery just for its own existence, you know.
that's a lot of musicians I know. They got tired of going to live shows because they don't want to be around live music anymore because they're just doing it all the time.
Yep.
So getting a little bit deeper into Dracula, when you had the idea and you're talking to Kelley about it, was there ever a point, because I've heard both of you speak on it, but not specifically, was there ever a point where you're like, we're going to shop this to different publishers, or was the kind of the idea was like, let's go in on crowdfunding?
We had the crowdfunding idea early on, or I did anyway. I said, Kelley, I've been in independent comics like since the beginning, since independent comics existed.
Yeah.
And I've kind of seen every aspect of it. And now there's this new template, there's this new way of doing things. And I really want to give it a shot, and he did too. So yeah, from the very beginning, we decided we wanted to do that. Kelley keeps saying, cause we did it cause, a publisher wouldn't let us do the things we wanted to do. And I was just like,
yeah.
I'm used to that thing. He's used to yank your chain. I was like, no, Kelley, I get to do whatever the fuck I want. So.
And that's a great thing. I mean, you've earned your stripes, right?
Yeah.
Like you're not year 5 Matt Wagner.
Yeah. But it was an intriguing thing to reach out directly to consumers as opposed to through retailers, that middleman of a retailer. Not that we dislike our retailers, we love them, but just wanted to try something new. And so for this project, we feel it works. We'll be doing it with all the remaining 3 volumes. So, and similarly, we will be launching on Halloween every year. So
that's awesome. So
I've written the second one. Kelley's about a third of the way through drawing it.
Wow.
So cooking right along.
And but it is getting some kind of release with Dark Horse in the future.
Dark Horse is doing the trade paperback edition. Yeah.
Okay. Yep. The hardcover is only for the Kickstarter. Yeah, as soon as
Kickstarter is the only place you'll be able to get the hardcover editions. Yes.
Yeah. Yep. As soon as I saw,
and that that worked out well because once we launched the Kickstarter, boy, we heard from a lot of retailers that were just like, we want to be able to offer this to our buyers, and we talked. Of course, I have this just healthy, ongoing relationship with Dark Horse, and I live in the same town and everything, and they were on board right away. They were like, yeah, that's a no-brainer, sure, So
I do want to put a pin in Dracula and just talk about Portland comic shops. Now, I live there for a brief period. I'm up in Tacoma, so I go down there often. But it is the comicopia. It is heaven on earth. Do you have a specific story that you want to talk about? Shout out. I do like to talk about comic stores on this channel, obviously, to get people to go and spend money.
I guess 2 of my favorites would be Floating World and Cosmic Monkey.
Yeah.
Floating World tends to be a little more artsy, and Floating Monkeys a little more commercial, but I wouldn't claim that exclusively of either of them. You can find plenty of indie stuff and progressive stuff at Cosmic Monkey, and you can still find commercial stuff at Floating World. So
right.
Both run by good people that are dedicated to comics and really, I think, do a fine job of both presenting a welcoming environment for shoppers and providing lots of good material to be available to shoppers.
Yeah. And what's amazing about Floating World, they do a lot of importing from France. They do a lot of Mobius importing, and then Japan. You can find some rare manga and even I found a lot of Atomo stuff there. Were you were you looking at manga at all when you were younger, or
manga? The early Grendels had kind of an anime manga sort of influence, and that was because I had just discovered it. I think Captain Harlock was the first thing I really saw. And you got to remember, it wasn't all over the place like it is now. It was this weird, rare thing that you only kind of saw here and there. But I'd say it was more I kind of got that out of my system and left it behind. I drew like that for a few issues, and then I was like, yeah, okay. And then I started to get more entranced with European comics. And in fact, my wife, when I first got together with my wife, she was from Montreal, and I lived up there with her for a couple of years. And of course, I could go to French bookstores that had French comics. French bande dessinée is what they call them in France, which means design bands, design strips. BD is what they call them.
Yeah.
And I couldn't read them very well, but you just go in and it was the whole shelf full of Hugo Pratt and Tintin and all sorts of great European cartoonists. So
very influential stuff.
That was a terrific resource to have. A good stage in my life, a creative, important stage in my life.
Some cities are in North America are a lot easier to find weird and import stuff. I mean, New York obviously is one of them too.
New York.
Yeah. So back to Dracula. How many pages is the first volume going to be?
The first one's 96 story pages, and they'll all hover around that. The second one's 120.
Okay, 120.
We're letting the story dictate the page length.
Yeah.
The second one got into a larger story and just felt like I needed more space. And Kelly's like, "Yep, that's fine with me." So Kelley is really like Kelly's wife used to say to him, "You're working on Dracula Day, aren't you?" He'd say, "Yeah, how can you tell? Because you're in such a good mood."
Yeah, he's really like his enthusiasm for this project, and it's one of the things that's the selling point. I think you're very aware by the amount of kind of press you've done leading into the Kickstarter, is that your enthusiasm is really selling this to people.
Yeah, we both love Dracula, and again, every version of it was unsatisfying to us.
Yeah,
in regards to what we wanted to see out of any further Dracula projects beyond the novel. They all have good stuff. In fact, I read a neat novel from back in the early 90s, maybe late 80s, recently called The Bargain. And it was all about Dracula and Hitler.
Oh, wow.
And it was really good. It wasn't super garish. It really captured the kind of dreamy horror of vampire fiction. And of course contrasted it with the horror that the Nazis were bringing into the world. And really, really terrific. But we did a on a horror website called Cradle to the Grave. We did a thing where we all brought our 5 favorite Dracula films, our favorite Dracula movies. And every one of them was with the caveat of this one's good except for this, and this one's good except for this.
Can you rattle off those 5 movies? I'd love to do a little research.
Mine were Nosferatu.
Yeah,
the original. The second, I think it's the second Christopher Lee one, Prince of Darkness.
Prince of Darkness, yeah.
The Coppola one, which like I said, I have a real love-hate relationship with, because I also hate the casting in it. I think the cast is just terrible.
What, even Gary Oldman?
Oh, I think he's awful. Yeah. Awful. I mean, he's okay when he's at the castle. Then he gets to London and he's this foppy, lovesick fool. He's not staring at all anymore,
Yeah.
Keanu's
he's Keanu.
Keanu's accent is just ridiculous. Winona Ryder's isn't much better. Winona, is supposed to at a certain point have unleashed this lusty inner self, and it seems like a put on, like it. And Anthony Hopkins can't figure out who the hell Van Helsing's supposed to be. I mean, he's just all over the board. Now, I will say that I have since read various analyses that point out that you're supposed to assume that he has syphilis, and that's
okay.
And that's why he acts real crazy some of the times, because at the very beginning he's talking about venereal diseases the very first time you see him. I think the guys that played the 3 suitors, Lucy's 3 suitors, are really quite good. But I hate Tom Waits as Renfield. I think that's just kind of put on.
Yeah. It's weights
unbelievable.
being weights.
Here's what really kills me is that the final casting was down to Gary Oldman or Gabriel Byrne to be Dracula.
Interesting.
And Byrne couldn't do it. He was in the midst of a messy divorce and couldn't leave LA to go film where they were going to film. And I just think he would have made a much, much more interesting Dracula than Gary Oldman.
Great actor. He was the devil in that. Can't remember the name of that Schwarzenegger movie, and he was the best part of that movie.
Yeah.
Last days. Dave Correa asked if you've seen, and I've heard you talk about it, Last Voyage of the Demeter, which I've heard you say positive things about it.
Oh yeah. It's got a lot of good stuff in it. It's a real clever take on what is basically just one chapter in the book. It misses its mark at the end, though. And it's funny. I saw it with my son, and we turned to each other at the end, and we both said the same thing, which was, once they got back to London, you had to see him in his human form, and instead they had him still in his beast form, but dressed up in his top hat and everything. I said, you didn't even really need to see him. All you needed to see was a human hand and hear his voice. You had to know that he could put this on, that he wasn't always that bat creature thing.
Yeah,
that was an unleashed primal version of himself that when he was out to sea. But part of my approach to the character is that he, in the book, he's so much more powerful than any other vampires we see. And granted, we don't see many other vampires, and every other vampire we see is a woman. But he can control the weather, and he can command beasts, and he can change form. The other vampires, we see all of them, they can turn into a mist, and they can ethereate through things. But my idea was, how's he have all these other powers? So we explained how he does, also based on something from the book, mentioned in the book. Additionally, I was just determined that he had to have a truly unique way that he became a vampire. I couldn't just have another vampire bite him. That's boring, and that doesn't make him Dracula,
Right.
There has to be a reason that he's the big badass vampire, and we give it a reason. We give it a good. He has a very unique origin. Yeah.
Was there any what other, besides that actual original book, was there any other Bram Stoker research that you were able to do? Maybe, like, I don't know if he has any notebooks and stuff like that.
So there's a really great, sadly recently deceased horror historian named David Skaal, spelled Skaal, and he wrote one of my favorite histories of horror called The Monster Show.
Okay.
Wherein he equates Europe and America's fascination with horror dovetailing with the end of World War I. And the reason being, for the first time, you had these just horrible engines of war that would cause these just terrible wounds. And medical science had just caught up enough to where we could keep these people alive and send them back to society. So all of a sudden, your loved ones were coming home and they were monsterized.
Right.
And you were faced with atrocity in a way that you couldn't escape and couldn't ignore. And anyway, Skaal wrote several books about. He wrote one called Hollywood Gothic that was all about the journey of Dracula from book to stage play to the pirated version, Nosferatu, to ultimately the Lugosi version. The Lugosi version is unique in that was the very first American horror film to feature the supernatural. And there's so many terrific silent horror movies. They always have a rational explanation. Phantom of the Opera is just a deformed guy. The characters in London After Midnight, that's not really a vampire. Dracula was the first American film to feature the supernatural.
I did not know that.
That's why it had such a huge lasting effect. Then Skaal also wrote a big, thick biography, exhaustive biography of Stoker that I read called Something in the Blood. Stoker and the creation of that book, he wrote a bunch of other books. None of them are any good.
Of course.
They're real, like, tepid pot boilers that don't really gel in any way.
Yeah.
But I don't know, something like the muses struck and the lightning struck and something really worked with Dracula. Yeah.
He was J.D. Salinger of horror, you know?
Yeah. Well, and he was inspired. I don't know if you know much about Stoker's life outside of being an author, but he was a theater manager. He was originally an Irish civil servant who later moved to London. He loved the theater and he wrote theater reviews. And he moved to London and started working at the Lyceum Theater as the manager for that theater, which was had one incredible star performer, a fellow named Henry Irving, first actor who was ever knighted.
Oh, wow.
And if you go and look at Irving is who he was describing when he described Dracula. This tall, imperious, aquiline-featured son of a bitch. And Stoker had this real, like, Dracula and Renfield sort of relationship with Irving. Irving was very abusive of him, but Stoker was incredibly dedicated to him. So obviously all that fed into the narrative,
It's kind of wild when you think somebody, Derek brought up a point of the Dracula puppet opera from Forgetting Sarah Marshall, and it.
Oh yeah, that's great.
It is great. It kind of made me think though, like, look at Bram Stoker writes this book and this character. We go through the ages, like you were just saying, and a lot of us grew up watching the Count as a Sesame Street character.
Sure. Well, this is what I mean about how much the image of Dracula has bled into society as a whole. Again, you can go to the most undeveloped part of the Philippines, of deepest of India, and you say Dracula, and an image is gonna come to their mind. They're gonna know who that is,
Yeah, and it does permeate culture in a way that you could probably sit down and write like a thesis about all of these things that have come. Like the way we talk about garlic is a joke sometimes because of vampires. I mean, people do this as a joke for certain things that don't have anything to do with vampires. It is such a fascinating thing, and I'm really excited for the books. Obviously, what else? Anything else we can expect from this first story that without going far into spoilers?
Well, so it takes place back. It starts in the mid 15th century, 1450 something, and again there are a few vague references in the book that I can't believe nobody's ever done anything with, about how he trained to get these extra powers, about how he is basically a necromancer outside of being a vampire, and I mean, I have some history of writing likable evil characters, characters that you're fascinated with, again, like Hannibal Lecter, like Hunter Rose. I said, imagine this is Darth Vader telling it from his side of things, and the key was to make him this imperious son of a bitch, like I said, this guy who is a leader and feels that he's ordained to have things his way, and doesn't compromise anything, and isn't really a romantic character. There's bits in the book when he interrupts the brides when they're getting ready to feed on Harker, and they kind of whine about how he used to love them. So we touch on that a bit in upcoming books, but again, he is not a romantic character. All this stuff, so many versions are just like, this was my lost reincarnated lover back, now Mina's my reincarnated lover from back when I was Vlad the Impaler. And in fact, that stems from, this was one of my top 5 Dracula movies. That stems from the TV version that was produced and directed by Dan Curtis of Dark Shadows fame in the 70s, starring Jack Palance. And in fact, that movie was so popular at the time that when Marvel launched Tomb of Dracula, Gene Colan looked at Jack Palance as his model for Dracula. If you go look at Gene Colan's Dracula, he has a wide face, kind of like Jack Palance. He has the same kind of that kind of eyebrow sort of look. But that was the first instance in a screenplay by Richard Matheson, who also wrote I Am Legend and also wrote the screenplay for The Night Stalker, the first Night Stalker film. That's the first one where Dracula sees Mina as the reincarnation of his lost love. And boy, they've just never dropped that since. It just the vampire finding, this modern woman who reminds him of a woman he loved when he was alive or first became a vampire. That's just so prevalent. We're not doing that.
I mean, I got to imagine it's American audience thing too, where like you just have to bring in the romance because people can't take a horror brutal, like brutal stories don't really go well. You need some love, which you don't. You don't.
No,
Although
you don't. No, you'll see. You don't. Yeah. I mean, it's he is a human being. He does. He's not devoid of all feeling.
Yeah.
But his megalomaniacal narcissism is, hopefully fascinating. Look, there's a megalomaniacal narcissist in our public life right now that people can't seem to tear their fucking eyes off.
Very, very unfortunately, and it
yes.
sucks.
So I find those are captivating characters, and
they are,
yeah. It's a deep well. It's a deep well that I'm having a lot of fun with. I find his voice. I fell into his voice very, very easily, and I really.
Here's an interesting character.
Yeah, I was just reading that comment about.
Growing up in Russia, we had.
You never drank blood for some reason. That's weird. Yeah.
That's a very interesting. That is a very interesting thing.
Yeah.
I mean, that's another thing that I'm sure there's studies on, like all of the other, characters, monsters, creatures that we probably at this point take for granted that were, inspired by Dracula, that we might not even be, know that were inspired by Dracula. So it is. He is a fascinating thing, and well, I love it.
I would claim Batman is to some degree. Sure. Certainly, the Shadow is to some degree. The Shadow kind of looks like Dracula in those early novels. But Stephen King wrote a really terrific analysis of horror called Dance Macabre, where he broke most horror fiction down into various archetypes. And it was Dracula, Frankenstein, the Wolfman, and as a subset, the Ghost.
Okay.
And the Wolfman is the lurking beast within. The Frankenstein is the shuffling monster that has no name, and Dracula is consumption. Dracula is the thing that consumes you, and makes you like it.
Yeah, he puts you in a trance, and that being said, with the Frankenstein, we already have the opus, and it was Bernie, and now we've got you guys doing Dracula.
Hopefully, we got a great endorsement early on when we announced it. I got a Twitter comment on one of my posts from Leslie Klinger, who's a Dracula scholar and wrote the most recent annotated Dracula. He also did the annotated Sherlock Holmes and Frankenstein and Jekyll and Hyde. The guy's knows his stuff. And I contacted him and said, "Oh, Les, I'd love to show you the book. And if you feel like giving us a quote, that would be great." And he gave us this glowing quote. So I feel like I got the approval from the Dracula professor.
Well. Maybe you can get a copy to Stephen King, and you can get an adjoining.
We got not quite Stephen, but we got a back quote from Joe Hill.
Wow! Oh, awesome! Joe is
so fantastic. Leslie Klinger, the Dracula scholar, Joe Hill, and Neil Gaiman.
Wow, nice. That is glowing reviews, and so we can expect people to back.
Somebody's just commenting there on Dracula Dead and loving it. I've never really been big on vampire humor. Dead and loving it. I haven't even watched Renfield because I just don't have much interest. What was the other one? Leslie Nielsen.
What We Do in the Shadows.
No, it was Love at First Bite. Yeah, What We Do in the Shadows is like it stands alone. Is like the fact that there's 5 seasons of that show on a joke that should have worn itself out in 10 minutes, and it's still absolutely hilarious at every step of the game. But I just watched a film the other night on Tubi. It's a German film from about 10 years ago called Therapy for a Vampire.
Interesting.
It's a comedy, but it's not real broad American humor. It's much more kind of subtle, funny, European style humor, that's like, more than ha.
Yeah. Right.
I quite enjoyed it, so that was kind of a blast. But
and I've heard you talk about it, and I agree with one of the best, if not the best, modern vampire story is let the right one in. Yeah, it really was.
Like,
and that
horror fiction always needs to talk about something else.
Sure.
It needs to talk about the scares aren't the point. The deeper thing it's talking about is the point. Like for instance, The Thing, John Carpenter's The Thing, is all about isolation and paranoia. And Let the Right One In's about loneliness.
Yes.
And it's either the loneliness of being a bullied 12-year-old boy or the loneliness of being an isolated 200-year-old vampire.
That's a girl. That's a little girl.
Yeah. Well, it's actually a castrated boy.
Oh shit! It's been a long time.
There's a brief scene where he sees her, Ely, changing clothes, and there's a scar in her crotch.
Yeah.
And look, it's a castrated boy. Yeah.
Is it? Okay. Yep. It is interesting. I'd like to throw another movie into that hat of having to say something. Not just Night of the Living Dead, but Romero's Dawn of the Dead, about early
consumerism. Absolutely.
Consumerism.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. So
the way the zombies just come to the mall because it's like comforting. Yeah.
Yeah, which is not really the case anymore in the last decade. Things are changing, but yeah, I got to speak.
It was true. It was absolutely true. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, I got to speak to Romero about that, and his face lit up because he was a Q&A at a screening, and his face lit up when I was like, yeah, so let's talk about that, and he went on for like 20 minutes about it. But you're right, like horror, otherwise you're just dealing with torture porn. You're dealing with that type of stuff if there's nothing to be said.
Yeah, like Frankenstein, the original Frankenstein novel, is a fear of the new lengths that science was going to, and whether that mankind would be able to control that. The Exorcist is a fear of women growing up. It's a fear of menstruation and a fear of the sort of the fact that men don't know what that is going to release into the world and fear it. Rosemary's Baby, fear of pregnancy. The fear of in this case it's the woman's fear of pregnancy. Rather than the men's fear. By the same author, Ira Levin. Stepford Wives, fear of conformity and the suburbs and the dehumanizing effect that perfection places on you. Great horror fiction stands out. There are those that are just gore fests and they're fine for what they are, but great horror fiction, the stuff that lasts, has something else to say.
Yeah, and I talk about it a lot on this channel, and my favorite movie of all time, and I think it's the most perfect movie of all time, is Jaws. And it's interesting because when Benchley wrote that, like he didn't, and then it gets opted for movie, he didn't know the negative effect it was going to have on.
He spent the rest of his life saving sharks.
Yeah. but that movie to me, like, because it's not straight horror, it's just a perfect, flick. There's messages in there, but it's one of those things that like I've looked for messages and there's nothing. It came after. All the messages came after that movie came out, But and then I did want to ask you is I know Kelley talks about it and you can see it as art, but was Frankenstein, Bernie's book, a big influence or a big book for you?
Absolutely. Yeah. In fact, at one point I pictured doing a version like that myself of Dracula, me illustrating it. I don't think I'm the right artist for that. I don't quite have that sense of texture, that intricacy. In fact, just the other night I was rewatching, first time I'd seen it in years, Mario Bava's first film, Black Sunday, which is about a witch / vampire. But I'm watching it and I text Kelley. I was like, okay, dude, this has to be like one of your favorite films of all time because every frame looks like you drew it.
I'll have to watch that. I've never seen a Bava flick.
Oh God! Again, it's on Tubi. You can find it on Tubi. Black Sunday. Okay. It's phenomenal. Just absolutely brilliant art direction, brilliant framing, brilliant lighting. It's dubbed in Italian, so it's the acting's stiff, but boy, it's certainly great to look at.
Wow, that's I recently had Tula Lotte and
And I
Becky.
will say, Kelley answered me, if I could have, I would have named my first kid Black Sunday.
Oh my God. Yeah, I love hearing about movies that were, inspiring comics. And I was just about to say I had Tula Lotte and Becky Cloonan on, and we were talking about Somna, and they were both heralding this movie Witchfinder General
Yeah,
from
that's another good
yeah.
one.
And so I watched that, and that was a great movie. I
Yeah.
had so much fun watching it.
Yep.
All right, so before I let you go, what besides obviously the Kickstarter reward should be showing up in October, right? The first book, and then the new Kickstarter will be Halloween again, like you said.
Previous to both of those, though, is my new Grendel series. So
That's what I was just going to ask you about.
that. So it's called Devil's Crucible, and it
Mhm.
is the direct sequel to the previous series from a few years back, Grendel Devil's Odyssey.
Odyssey. Yeah.
Devil's Odyssey followed Grendel Prime into outer space looking for a new home for humanity. He failed. He came back to Earth, and things have changed dramatically because he was gone 500 years.
Mhm.
This overall storyline, Grendel's Devil's Crucible, is broken up into 3 4-issue series. The first one's called Devil's Crucible Defiance. The middle one's called Devil's Crucible Sedition. And the last one's called Devil's Crucible Necrotic.
Okay.
And a lot of cool surprises. People are going to be thrilled with a lot of what's going on in there. But yeah, the world's not the same as when Grendel Prime left it at all. And I'll just take an opportunity here to show. I just got these in.
Oh, nice. Wait, let me make you bigger so we can get you in there.
From the Long Box Hero collection. They turned out pretty darn cool.
That's great. Oh, look at that.
Yeah.
It's got some articulation on it. It looks just like.
So you can find these either at your local comic book shop or various toy sellers online have them as well.
Sure.
So
that's awesome.
Yep.
Yeah, and it's funny. I like Grendel's been around a long time. There's a lot of stories, but I got to give a shout out. Comic Tropes did a great video a couple years ago that kind of just went through it all and gave you like the through line of the great.
Yeah, he got
story.
Most everything right. He had a few little things. I was like, well, that was not quite right.
So he got those. Yeah. Well, you're the one who's got it all in there. Yeah. And then I don't know if you saw, but Casper was in there. And do you know if you're going to be back at OAX yet? Can we hopefully?
I don't know if they invite me again. I really like that. That was my first convention since the pandemic.
Yeah.
The pandemic, everything closed down, and then I just got to the point where I wasn't quite missing conventions.
Sure.
And then they invited me to OAX, and that one I really liked because it was evocative of older style conventions, smaller.
Yes.
These huge festivals. God, they just suck the energy out of you. They're like a vampire themselves. They're like Colin Robinson on What We Do in the Shadows.
Yeah.
I'm doing a one-day show in Memphis in about a month from now. It's May 18th. It is at the main branch. I forget the name. The main branch of the Memphis Public Library system.
Oh, cool.
Gene Haw and I are the 2 guests. Again,
nice.
Just a one-day show. After that, in August, I'll be in Houston. And in October, I'll be in Cincinnati.
Okay.
The 2 names of those shows are escaping me at the moment, but if you check my Facebook and Twitter feeds, I'll be promoting those.
Right, and then also let's give
Todd Toys. No, it's the Fresh Monkey Fiction. They did a collection called the Long Box Heroes, and they did a whole.
Oh wow! It's all the Tick, Madman,
the Goon, Rocketeer, Madman. Who else is back here?
That's like that's everybody.
Airboy. Yeah, pretty cool.
Everybody represented there. Eric Powell, who's a fellow Portlandian, and you got Allred, who's down in Eugene.
Portland is lousy with comic book artists. I always you can't spit without hitting one of us.
Seriously, or a writer like there's Bendit, there's Fraction. Fantastic city.
Fraction, Rucka.
Yeah. And then let's give a shout out to Jim Warden, who sells
my art dealer. Yep.
Yeah, and there's a link in the description below for his website if you want to buy any of Matt's original art. I kind of feel
an inquiry to his email, which is Caps hockey fan. He lives in the Washington D.C. area. Caps hockey fan at yahoo.com.
Yeah,
just put Matt Wagner art inquiry in your subject line.
Yeah, so you can buy some of that. And anything else coming out? Like anything?
I'm working on, for years and years, I had a website that I just kind of never did much with, and I let it lapse. So now we're putting together a brand new website that'll launch pretty soon, which is going to have a store where I'm going to be selling off a lot of my old stock. Over the years, I have just accumulated so much copies of my stuff that it was like, I just don't need all this. So you'll be able to buy back issues directly off me. And we'll ultimately be moving into some other stuff too, but I will alert everybody again on both my social pages when that goes live.
Sweet. And because this is not just a comic selling channel, not just a comics channel, but I am a voracious collector. It's just a wall of short boxes back there. How many copies of Primer 2 do you still own?
Oh, I think only 1 or 2.
Wow. Okay.
Too long ago, man.
Yeah. Tough book to find.
But at the same time, so I have a crawl space right off my studio here. When I say crawl space, it's big enough to walk in. But several years back, my son and I built a pallet that's probably 15 feet long, and I used 2x6s up on end, and there's probably 8 of those like this. So that's a pretty strong base.
Yeah.
Big piece of plywood on top of that. It's all bowing.
Oh my God.
From the amount of books on it. And that's my shit.
Yeah. And we're lucky in the Northwest that like books in even in attics, garages and stuff like that.
Yeah, they maintain
damaged. I've found some Golden Age collections that are like, I'm pulling out 9.2 slab, like I'm getting them slabbed at 9.2's 70-year-old books because they were in Tacoma in people's garages. So, well, Matt, I really appreciate it.
There. Kazra from OE.
Yeah, Kazra officially invited you. Yeah.
Try and get Kelley to come.
Yeah, he's got. I mean, look, we're all gonna fly across the country to get there anyway. So Kelley doesn't get off, like easy anyway. But I really appreciate the time.
Kelley doesn't so much to his art is the thing.
No, he doesn't.
He holds on to it. Yeah. So
and
that makes less of a reason for him to go, but we'll see. Maybe I can twist his arm.
Just he brings 10 pieces. That'll be fine. But I'd love to have you both on around the time that the next Kickstarter is ready to go.
Here, let me show one quick thing.
What do we got?
Just a moment.
Sure. Thanks everybody for watching, and don't forget, we got Japan Book Hunter coming up in about an hour and 20 minutes, and then Eric Larson's going to be here at 5 p.m. Pacific. Derek, they are going to be doing a trade paperback. Dark Horse will be releasing it, I guess, at the end of the year as well.
Kind of end of October, beginning of November. So it's about 3 to 4 weeks after the hardcover ships. So about halfway through the Kickstarter campaign, we started getting requests from people for original artwork. And so we decided to offer original sketches.
Right.
So for instance, here's a couple that I did.
Wow. Yeah, and you have the alternate cover on it. Wow, those.
Yeah. So I have the alternate color, and they come in these.
Orlock Press,
Orlock Press is the publishing entity Kelley and I formed to do this. But we got a rubber hand stamp made, and so every one of these envelopes is hand pressed by us.
That's awesome.
Then you get this comes in, and it'll be signed on the front by each of us too. So
man. Yeah, I don't remember what level I got. I think I might have gotten the 666 hardcover, the one that was was limited, because I mean, of course, I'm gonna, anytime that number pops up and I'm able to purchase I'll take it. But yeah, I'd love to have you both on close so we can pump the next Kickstarter and talk more about horror movies, because I got a lot of research to do and a lot of movies to watch, because I've heard you talk about a lot that I've never seen. And then also, like I said, congratulations on, Dead Boy Detectives hits Netflix in a week and a half, something like that.
It's pretty soon. Yeah.
And Matt, hey, man, it's such a pleasure, and thanks for doing this, and I can't wait to talk to you again.
Thanks for having me on, man.
Yeah,
thanks
of course.
For tuning in, everybody.
Yeah, everybody, and stick around. We got so much more. I'm going to be live for another 5 or 6 hours.
Good luck to your butt.
Thank you so much, Matt. All right. Take care.
See ya.
Hey, everybody. I hope you really enjoyed this interview with Matt Wagner if you didn't catch it live at Davenger Con or if you're just watching it on the replay. If you can, I'd really appreciate it if you help out the channel by hitting that like button, subscribing if you're not. Check out my new podcast, Direct Edition. You can find the links below in the description. And now I've got a merch store. If you're into that, you can buy Davenger Con hoodies and shirts, West Coast Davenger logo shirts, See Todd Buy Todd shirts, and some other fun stuff. It'll just help support the channel. If you're not into buying books, then you can just buy some merch. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time on the West Coast Davengers.